as I was unmuting myself, the sirens went off, and they're quite close to my house, so you probably would not have enjoyed hearing that, but now we are going to get started. So welcome and thanks for joining us. Oh, okay, sirens are happening again. Will somebody let me know whether I should keep going or whether that's bothersome in the background? I could pause for another minute.
I think you're fine.
Okay, all right, thanks everybody. You sound loud to me, but maybe not so much to you. That's good. All right, welcome everyone to our web chat with MN ABE. This is our quarterly statewide ABE discussion, and today is May 6th. On this slide is our ABE team. This is Jody. I am the ABE Program Quality Specialist on the team. There are a number of us on the webinar today, and I will let my colleagues introduce themselves. Let's start with Todd.
Hey everybody, this is Todd Wagner. I am the ABE State Director.
Thanks, Todd. And how about Brad?
Hello, everybody. This is Brad Haskamp, part of the ABE team.
Thanks, Brad. And Astrid.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Astrid, the Professional Development Specialist. Great to have you all here with us today.
Great. And you will see everyone else who is on this slide is also on our team, and we are currently all working from home. Our building is pretty empty these days. So for today's webinar, please do chime in using the chat function at any point. If you have a question that's sort of longer or you want to talk it out, we'll pause at a couple points throughout the webinar to take those kind of questions if need be. And if anyone is having any tech problems or need that kind of assistance, go ahead and chat to Carla, and she is helping to support us on this webinar today. So, in terms of our content for the day today, I want to be sure that you are aware that this session will focus on the ABE, the annual ABE grant application. We do have some other updates and announcements and things to share with you, but for the most part, the content that we're going to cover today is about the annual application. And just a note that we first gave this workshop at the Metro Regional on March 6th. Back, I think, for me, that was the last time that I had the privilege of being in a room with some of you all. That feels like a really long time ago. If you were in the room that day, please know that there are definitely some updates and changes, so we'll go through those today. And then, of course, we were going to do the workshop at the North and South Regionals in March and April, but those events were, of course, canceled. So we're hoping to cover a lot of that important information today. So here's our plan for today's webinar. Like I said, we have some updates and announcements. We have kind of a hot off the press update about GED testing. And then we will dive into the application, including the documents and the application itself and the tables. We have some reminders about ABE finance, particularly as we are approaching the end of the current fiscal year. And then we'll wrap up with some reminders and information about professional development. Great, so first of all, we are going to give you some updates and announcements, and I will turn it over to Todd to get it started.
Great, thanks, Jody. I have just one slide to go over with everybody. So two things. One, an update on things we are hearing at the state and federal legislative level. And then just a quick reminder about contact hours. So starting with legislation, what continues to look like potentially really good news for us is that there is an education bill that is working its way through the state legislature. Language appears in both Senate and House versions of the bill and appears to be non-controversial. And if that bill then ultimately is enacted with the current language, it would have the effect of increasing the state ABE appropriation for the 2021 program year by about 3% over the appropriation that we had for 1920. So that would be about $1.5 million increase. And the majority of that would, a little bit of that would, a small amount off the top would go to support supplemental services, and the rest of that would be passed through directly to ABE consortia. The second thing, so actually just to say about that first bullet, we're quite optimistic. It seems that this would has a pretty good chance of making it all the way through to being signed by the governor. Second bullet there is quite a bit longer reach, but nonetheless just wanted to make you aware that there is a bill called Relaunching America's Workforce Act that has been introduced in the House at the federal level. And it proposes a $1 billion appropriation for AFLA, for the Adult Education Family Literacy Act. And the current appropriation is just over $500 million. So that would be essentially a doubling of the federal allocation for adult basic ed. And so in Minnesota, that would mean in recent years, our total regular federal ABE fund plus IEL civics funding has been about $6 million. And so if that legislation were ultimately to be enacted, that would mean basically double that. So with any luck, something on the order of 12 million or about a $6 million increase. So quite optimistic on the first one. The second one, my understanding is that that bill does not have support of the Senate, at least not currently, and so seems quite a bit less likely. Then just reminders regarding contact hours. Our office, the ABE office, the Minnesota Department of Education, along with Literacy Action Network leadership, are collaborating to facilitate a process whereby we'll convene a group of ABE stakeholders to ultimately come up with a recommendation to advise the Minnesota Department of Ed ABE office regarding sort of decisions to be made about contact hours to be used in the formula for the 21-22 program year. So not this next year, but for the coming year, or excuse me, for the not this next immediate fiscal year, but the following fiscal year, 21-22. And then just a note related to that, as we did for the second half of March and for April, where we are not going to be using those contact hours in the 2020-21 formula. Rather, as you know, we're going to use hours that were recorded between March 14, 2019 and March 13, 2020. We will likely also not, pending the recommendation from the stakeholders and other considerations, but it is likely that hours from May of 2020, from this month, will also not be used in that 21-22 grant allocation formula. If you have any questions about those, we'll be coming back around to questions later as we go through the web chat, and we can address them then. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Brad to give a few more updates.
Thanks, Jody. One reminder I want to let you know about is that we have lifted the 12-hour restriction in SID for new students with no pretest during the school closure period. So if you have new students that have started and you're not able to give them a pretest at this point, don't worry, you now are able to enter 12+ hours. To do that, you'll want to make sure you enter the preset assessment option called COVID EFL Exception. And that's in the Students Assessment tab, and you can enter 12+ hours then at that point. Those hours that those students generate will count for state ABE funding if it's part of that reporting period. However, they may not count for federal ABE funding. We did send a memo from our office through Sherry on April 29th that provided more details on this option. Let's go to the next slide. One key note about this 12-hour exception that we want to make sure you're aware of is the length of the exception. Many of you are wondering, how long will it last? Well, we can't give you the exact date, but we can tell you that we will reinstate the 12-hour restriction again once in-person ABE testing can resume and or remote testing options are approved and available for all ABE programs and students. And note that we will give you a 1-month notice before we reinstate this restriction. And if you want to see more of the details, the SID team developed a great help article at the link that you can see there. You can also email SID staff at support@mnabe.org, or you can email me if you have more questions about the exception to the 12-hour rule or restriction. Then I did talk about remote testing, and we are going to approve remote, or we did have approved NRS testing remotely for ABE programs as soon as the vendors allow it, as long as it adheres to the requirements set by those test vendors and the Minnesota or the U.S. Department of Education. Let's give you some of the details of what those tests look like. So with Best Plus, they were the first to announce a remote testing option, and that is available with training. If you have questions about that, contact Linda Keller at Metro North. She's one of our state assessment trainers. However, I do know that Metro North is probably the only consortium using that test. We also have CASAs. They are making remote e-testing via Zoom or Google Meet available this month to programs who are already doing computer-based CASAs testing. And we're hearing from programs like Metro South that are going to be part of that pilot. So that is great. But please note, you do need to be already offering e-testing with CASAs in order to make that available. Now, TABE has more details here. With TABE, they have made computer-based 1112 TABE available via web conferencing for TABE test administrators. You do need a DRC Insight account in order to make that happen. And there is information on creating a DRC Insight account at tabetest.com. In addition, they have made their locator unlocked, meaning that's available to programs for free if they have, again, a DRC Insight account. So you could be sending the locator to your students for free, and then whether or not you have paid for e-testing with TABE 1112. There is training that started last week by DRC on how to do this. They also have quite a bit of guidance available on their website at tabetest.com. So I encourage you to check that out. We are going to give you some additional training and have some additional time for discussion on remote CASAs and TABE testing options Friday, May 15th from 10 to 11:30 a.m. This will be a session that is co-led by the Minnesota Department of Education Adult Education team and by our state assessment trainers, Marty Olson and Linda Keller. You can see the link there for webinar registration for that remote CASAs and TABE testing session, and we'll share some additional resources at that time.
Great. Thank you, Brad, for those updates. One additional update about teacher-created courses for distance learning. The distance learning team originally shared this update last week, and we wanted to send the message out again to remind people of it. So we know that currently a lot of ABE instructors are working very hard to create online courses for their students, and this has led to many requests for approval of those courses to count for contact or proxy hours. So the distance learning team has worked together with our MDE ABE team to develop a process for approval. And for the purpose of this approval, the way course is being defined is a series of at least 12 online lessons totaling at least 20 hours, created by a teacher initially for their own use and later potentially for use by others in ABE. So we want to remind you that this process exists. Also, we want to note that an online course does not have to be approved by us here at MDE or by the DL team in order for you to be using it, but this approval process is specifically to be able to count the student time as contact or proxy hours. Now, we have heard from the DL team that there's high demand right now for their attention on approving these things. And so we know that it's not going to be a super speedy or instantaneous process to get things approved. And we encourage you to keep in mind the message that Todd mentioned earlier, which is currently this month, in the month of May, it is very likely that we will not use these hours currently being generated towards the funding formula for fiscal year 22. So we want you to feel to prioritize doing the right things for your students and using this time to explore and develop and not and be patient with the distance learning team as we get things approved. So more information about that approval process and the application is available on the MN ABE Distance Learning website. That image shows you where to find it on that site. And also, Susan WB will be doing a webinar to give folks more information about that. That is a week from today. So if you are interested in getting a course approved and you want to understand how that process works, please do join that training.
Jody, before we move on, we did have a question in the chat that we want to make sure to clarify, asking whether hours can be counted for adult diploma students who are working with teacher-created courses, even if they are not eligible for contact or proxy hours. And yes, those hours can be counted as instructional time, even if they are not official hours.
Yes, excellent question, Andy, and that's right. Yep, those hours, you could still include that in the adult diploma portfolio when you're talking about how much instruction the student did. Yes, you could definitely include those hours.
Yes. And another question about whether there will be additional guidance regarding copyright. There is some guidance currently associated with the guidance available with those application forms. If you feel like you need additional information, I would encourage you to contact the distance learning team for that information, and Susan Wittenkamp-Brandt.
Yes, excellent question. Maybe Susan can chime in specifically, but I presume that Susan's guidance and support to the field will address how to think about copyright. Jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, Susan. Yes, although we recognize Susan is not a copyright lawyer. Good point. All right, thank you. I'm going to keep going. Another announcement / reminder, the 2020 narrative due date has been extended as a result of COVID-19. So the original due date of June 1st has been extended out to August 1st. On this slide is the list of consortia who are required to submit a narrative in 2020, and I know that all of you are aware of this extension, and I know that you are working hard to get those narratives finished up in the midst of all the other very hard work that you are also doing right now. So thank you for that. This also impacts consortia who are submitting narratives in 2021. And I want to be sure that this group of folks are aware of how these changes will affect you. So on this slide is the list of consortia who are required to submit in 2021. And what that means is this is the list of consortia who are required to review narratives submitted in 2020. So for 2021 narrative writers, please update your calendars. Hopefully you had that June review and an in-person review date in June. You had that on your calendar, but you can now take that off. There will be no review activity happening in June. Instead, we need you to think about August. So what we know about August is that narrative reviewers will be asked to review those narratives, review 1 or 2 narratives individually and score them. We are still figuring out how to do the group reviews. And normally we do that in person, but we are not going to do that this August. We are looking to convene some groups online or via webinar, but we need some input from managers of this cohort to figure out exactly how to schedule that. Please note you should have Tuesday, September 29th set aside if you are in one of these consortia. Please leave that event on your calendar. It's maybe unlikely at this point that would happen in person, but we will plan to have a workshop on that day, either in person, maybe hybrid, or maybe just completely online. So I did send an email to this group of managers yesterday. So please see that email from me if you haven't already, and watch for an upcoming survey to find out about your availability in August. And just a very last note about 5-year narratives. We may very well be in need of additional reviewers from other consortia who are not required to review. So if you think that reviewing 5-year narratives and learning more about what other ABE consortia do is something you'd be interested in doing, and you'd be available to do that in August of this year, shoot me an email and let me know. All right, before we go on to GED testing, I'm going to pause for just a second to see if there are any other questions about any of these updates that we need to address.
Jody, not seeing anything coming in about narratives.
All right, great. Thanks, Astrid. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Brad for some GED testing updates.
Thank you, Jody. We do definitely have some GED testing updates for you today. And if you were checking your email just before the webinar, you might have seen some of these webinars or some of these updates. So we do know that the status has been that during the governor's stay-at-home order, and while businesses that work with clients face-to-face are closed, GED testing centers have also been closed across the state of Minnesota. There have been some exceptions with, in limited cases with corrections where they are still operating, but we know that they have been doing limited capacity even in the prisons. Let's move to the next slide. So as we look at this, there are a couple things that we're looking at with GED testing. First, we are exploring OP or online proctoring with the GED test. Minnesota will be part of phase 2 of this process. And that will not be available until at the very earliest, the 3rd week of May. And so look for more details there or later about that once that timeline is confirmed. The test cost for online proctoring would be the same as the on-site GED testing. And remember, the way that OP works is that this would be a tester taking the test at home on an approved laptop or computer, where they would be taking the test virtually and then proctored online. So the proctors in those cases are actually from OnView, not from our local testing centers necessarily, and they will nationally have a prioritized list of testers. And basically they're looking for people that have a GED Ready Green score within the last 60 days, and those that have whose tests were canceled due to COVID-19, those that only have one test left. And in the state of Minnesota, we have also identified later on some priorities about those with job offers, those enlisting in the military, certain students that are court ordered, and also have a GED Ready Green score. Now, one thing that we are being requested by GED Testing Service is if there are some high priority testers that need to take the test due to many of those reasons, please share that information with me, especially the GED tester's name and their GED ID number, along with a little bit about the tester. And I will be collecting that information as we go forward if they would be, to see if they would be a good candidate for OP and to maybe put them in the queue for OP down the road. Let's move to the next slide. The other big announcement from today is that the Commissioner of Education has announced that operating a GED testing center is in compliance with the Minnesota Department of Health guidelines is an allowable use of a public school building. You will see in your attached materials that there is a document labeled 42920 Minnesota Department of Health School Building Use Guidance. I really encourage you to download that 4-page document and look through the details of what those Minnesota Department of Health guidelines are. But basically what this says, if we go to the next slide, is that that GED testing can occur in K-12 public school buildings, and it is permissive. It doesn't mean that K-12, that GED testing centers in K-12 public school buildings have to offer GED testing. It is saying they can offer GED testing if they choose, as long as they adhere to the Minnesota Department of Health guidance with the document attached. And we also want to be clear that this permission does not waive any requirements set by GED Testing Service or Pearson VUE. So please make sure you're adhering to all of the guidelines from GED Testing Service or Pearson VUE in this process. Let's go to the next slide. The other thing we are announcing is that we are having a GED virtual meeting on GED testing. That meeting is tomorrow from 9:30 to 11 a.m. There's the link to register. Please note we are really hoping that this session is primarily for GED testing staff, and so those working in the GED testing centers in Minnesota or with those GED testing centers in Minnesota. It also could be we also are encouraging ABE administrators to participate in that session on tomorrow. If you have additional questions, please feel free to contact me or Todd, and our emails are on the screen there. So I believe that's our last slide on GED. Am I correct, Jody?
That's right. Looks like there's a couple questions in the chat. Astrid, do you want to help us?
Yes, yeah, before we take those questions, Brad, will you be recording that webinar?
Oh, great reminder. Yes, we will be recording that webinar, that meeting, and we will be posting it to mnabe.org.
Excellent, thank you. So just as a reminder, we currently still only have a capacity for 200 people to attend our webinars. So again, if you could please save those seats for the testing center staff and ABE program managers who are running those testing centers. Other folks will be able to access the recording to get the information. So a couple of questions in the chat. Brad, are top priority students for those with any one of those conditions, canceled test or one test left, or GED ready testing green score?
So generally in the initial pilot, and I might encourage Melissa Haltstrand to correct me if I'm saying any of this wrong. So Astrid, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Melissa Haltstrand so she can jump in if needed. But GED Testing Service, with their initial list of priority students or testers, they are saying that any person, whether or not they have one test left, whether or not they had a canceled test, the one thing that they're looking for in their initial pilot are those that have a GED ready green within the last 60 days. So If you have a student that would like to test and they want to be part of that automatic pilot, that first round early piloting, they should make sure that they have a GED ready green within the last 60 days. On top of that, there are some testers that will be deemed priority from our office that might not necessarily have that GED ready green, and we want to collect that student information. So if you give us those testers, the name, the GED ID, and let us know a little bit, just a sentence or two about that student and why that tester should be a priority, we will collect that information and pass it on to GED so that they can be included. If that seems to meet a priority or be a priority, we can pass that on to GED testing service so they would be part of that approved priority list. Melissa, am I getting that correct enough at least? Anything you'd like to add?
Brad, you are correct. The one thing that I would like to add is when you look at the top category there where it says for those with canceled tests, 1 test left, GED ready testing green score, that if the tester has not taken the GED ready test yet, they'll be able to do so at a 50% off rate, and that code or that information will be on the dashboard of their account. So that's something to keep in mind. And that would have to be, and the other thing to keep in mind is that they are supposed to score in the green area within 60 days of them taking the test or them scheduling the test.
Oh, from them scheduling the test. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good reminder of that 60-day timeline.
Yeah.
And thank you for reminding me about the promotion. Yes.
Oh, no problem.
Brad, we have just a few more questions. For the webinar tomorrow, are GED testing centers at correctional facilities invited to that meeting?
Yes.
Okay. And as some centers reopen, will there be a list of which ones are open?
At this point, it is going to be a local planning option. We do want to be aware of test centers that are planning to open, but at this point, we do not have the ability to, at least from our office, to be like posting a list anywhere of which facilities are up and running. You will be able to see, or a tester will be able to see which test centers have openings. They will be able to see that if they go into GED.com and go to try to schedule a test. They can see if any test centers near them are open. Melissa, anything you would add to that?
I guess I would say that, and this will come with tomorrow at the meeting, we'll just remind test centers that in order for testers to see which test centers have availability soon or in the near future, that the test center will need to go into one of the Pearson VUE systems called Site Manager to update their hours, because most of them will show up as closed right now if a tester was to go into their account. But in order for a tester to see which test centers have availability in the near future, we need the test centers to go into Site Manager and update their hours.
Excellent. And we can talk more about that at the meeting tomorrow. I also see in the chat that the cutoff date for priority, there was a question about that. The cutoff date for priority is unknown at this point. So please, as you have those, let us know. Even once OP or online proctoring starts, if you have a student that needs to be a priority, let us know. Please keep sending us that information. As soon as we get that, we can pass that forward once we are able to send those students or those testers forward. And Margot also mentioned about paper-based testing being potentially an option. That will be something that we would talk about in a case-by-case or site-by-site situation, and that we can talk more about that tomorrow, Margot, in the meeting. So hopefully we can talk then in more detail. For the sake of time, Jody, I think I can continue to answer some questions in the chat, but I wonder if we want to move on to the next topic.
Yep, sounds good. Thank you for those updates, Brad. That's some really important information. I know a lot of people will be glad to get some of your students back up in GED testing again. Great. So those were all the updates that we had for you, and now we're going to transition into talking about the annual ABE grant application. So most of you know the annual application is the paperwork that you need to fill out and submit to MDE every year in order to continue receiving your annual state and federal ABE grants. So those documents, those materials are posted. They are available on the Department of Education website, which is education.mn.gov. And there are 3 documents: the application, the instructions, and the tables. And as usual, those are due on Monday, June 1st. They are due at 3:30 p.m. In previous years, there wasn't a time, so occasionally we had somebody submit at like 11:50 p.m., so you can't do that anymore. So it's sort of end of your business day on Monday, or 3:30 on Monday the 1st in serves. So there is one new thing that's different this year from previous years, and that is that these application documents can only be downloaded actually within the serves system. There's no longer sort of a public-facing place where you can grab those documents. So in order to download the documents, you will, or whoever is going to download the documents, will have to have serves access. And anyone who has serves access has to have their own account in this Education Identity and Access Management System, or we call it EDIM. I know I've been hearing from some of you that you already have these documents. I know some of you have gone through this hurdle, but just as an FYI that someone, either you as a manager or someone in your business office, will have to have this EDM account in order to be able to access serves and get these documents, and then by the deadline to be able to submit them. So there is, actually, this is just a screenshot. I was going to say there is a link, but when you go to the education.mn.gov website and navigate to the grant materials, it will lead you to a place where you can click to get more information about creating an EDM account. So once you or someone has been able to download those documents from the MDE website or serves, then the process is to complete 2 separate documents. One is the application, that's a Word document, and the other is the tables, and those are in Excel. Please note, because this is something that sometimes confuses folks, yes, unfortunately, your data from SID has to be typed into that Excel document. We wish that in an ideal world, our aid calculation software would be connected to SID, but the reality is those 2 systems live in 2 different places with 2 different entities and are not connected in any way. So you are the connection. Your tables are what gets your data from SID onto a document that can then be entered into the aid calculation software. Once those documents are filled out, you upload them back into serves, and then your authorized signer has to sign. That's a virtual process, not a physical signature, by the June 1st deadline. Usually this is your superintendent if you're in a district, or an executive director or some other designated leader. This is often the step that causes a lot of stress for people. ABE may not be the top of the priority list for whoever your authorized signer is. So we recommend that you just start thinking now about who that is and work with your business office to make sure that that person knows about the deadline and is ready to sign in and do what they need to do by then. So I'm just going to acknowledge, Laura, I see your question about an EDM account. Why don't you go ahead and shoot me an email, and I will connect you hopefully with the right person and the right resources in order to create that account, because yes, someone in your district will need to have an account. All right. In terms of the application materials, first I want to start by talking about the actual application document itself. So this is the application. A little screenshot of what it looks like. And truthfully, a lot of it is boilerplate. But we do want you to be aware, kind of a key important thing that is on the application is the assurances. Those are the agreements that the grantee is making by accepting these funds. So there are a lot of assurances on this document. Many of them are very generic and similar to any assurances that you might have for any grant funds or any government funding that's received, very generic things like don't embezzle money, right? In addition to those generic grant assurances, there are a set of ABE specific assurances. And I invite you, and for just a second, those of you who've been around for a while, because I know there are some of you listening who have been around for a while, and I wonder if you can remember any specific assurances that are on the application. I think there's about 15 or so ABE specific ones. If anybody's a fast typer, bonus points if you can type one in. The one that's listed here is sort of an overarching umbrella assurance. So it is to follow all relevant laws, statutes, policies, rules, and regulations. But there are a bunch of others that are a little more specific. Can I pause for a brief second, see if, yeah, good, Kristen. Yes, there's one about attending workshops, use of funds. Yeah, good memories, guys. So here are sort of plain language version of some of the other assurances. Use your funds only for ABE, submit annual reporting, hire licensed teachers, use SID, record contact hours correctly. Here's some more. You need to maintain email communication with our office. You have to attend key events, like Kristen mentioned. You have to have a consortium agreement, an MOU with your workforce center. So we just want you to be aware that these are the things that you are agreeing to when you accept these funds. Hopefully none of these things are a big surprise, but it's a good moment to review those every year when you sign the application or when you fill out the application. We wanted to let you know there's a couple assurances that are either new or revised this year. One is specifically about SID and that your program will follow the guidance on how you name and identify classes and sites within SID so that it provides accurate information for the Adult Literacy Hotline and for Career Force. And a final one that you will expend all revenue generated by student tuition and fees within the fiscal year it was received. This just means, as you know, you are permitted to charge reasonable tuition and or fees to your students. But when you do that, you can't just bank it away and save it up. You do need to then invest that back in your program within that same fiscal year. I'm going to pause for just a second. I don't think I saw any other questions about the application itself. Oh, sorry, wrong way.
Jody, we do have a question. Is there guidance on how to code and account for tuition and fees?
Good question, Kristen. We can help with that unless Todd has a really quick answer for that. Otherwise, why don't you put that in an email, Kristen, and we will, we can look that up for you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a quick answer either, Jody.
Okay, yeah. I don't have that answer off the top of my head, Kristen, but yes, we can investigate that. Teresa, I saw your request, so I'm going back for just a second. All right, and yeah, I'm going to move on and keep us going. We want to spend some time to talk about the tables. So the tables, as usual, are one Excel document, and this Excel document has 5 tabs at the bottom. So make sure that you click into all of those tabs and fill them all out before you submit the application and tables. I will start by talking about Table A, which is the first of the tables. This one is the same as it has been every year. This is where you enter student numbers and contact hours. On Table A, you will enter those for the same contact hour reporting period as usual, the traditional May to April period. However, please note that we, as I hope you all know by now, we have made an adjustment for fiscal year 2021 funding. So because of COVID-19, we're making a change that applies to fiscal year 2021. And just to be real clear about that, that means the funding that you are awarded for programming from July 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2021. Traditionally, the contact hour reporting period that we would use in the formula calculation to distribute that aid, normally we would use May 1st, 2019 through April 30th, 2020. Now, we all know what happened at the end of that time period, and as a result, we decided to basically just shift that contact hour reporting period back 6 weeks or so, and instead of using the traditional period, we're going to use the year between March 14th, 2019 and March 13th, 2020. And the reason we're doing that is to try to just get a year's worth of quote unquote normal ABE programming and leave, whatever happened after the COVID-19 disruptions began. We just want to kind of leave that out of the mix in terms of calculating funding for next year. So as a result, in the tables document of the annual application, there is a new table. Right after Table A is Table A1, and it has this updated contact hour reporting period. So then a couple of important notes about this, though. Whenever you solve a problem, you might inadvertently cause a few other problems. So we have realized that along the way, that our solution then caused a couple of kinks that we have to address. One of those little kinks is about distance learning proxy hours. If you or someone in your program entered a monthly total of distance learning proxy hours for some of your students for March, you'll need to go back in and split those hours. So you'll need to figure out as best you can which hours were earned between March 1st and March 13th and which hours were earned after that. Then you go back and delete that month-long entry or edit that entry, and then you'll need to make sure you have 2 entries, one with hours on or before the 13th, one with hours after the 13th. So you will need to do that before you run your reports from SID to fill out Table A1. So also an important note, when you go to do that in SID, there is no Table A1 report in SID. There is only a Table A report. So what you need to do in SID, you or someone, your data person needs to do in SID, is you need to run the Table A report twice with 2 different date ranges. First, you can run it with the traditional date range. It will default to having a May 1 to April 30th date range. Once you have that, then you need to change the dates and run them for this adjusted time period. So just note that in SID, that's the same report. In order to get that data, you just run that report twice with different dates. Some notes about Table A1. This data is really important for obvious reasons. It's directly tied to your funding. And as I noted before, it's the hours that you report on Table A1 that will be used in the official aid calculation for funding, not what is in SID. As I mentioned, those 2 software systems do not talk to each other. So If you underreport on table A1 because somebody forgot to enter some hours or something, entering them later in SID after your annual application is submitted won't change your funding. So please be sure that you have all of your hours entered correctly, everything checked and double checked before you pull that data for table A and table A1. And my last note about table A1. Again, another small kink that we realized once we put in a solution in place to adjust the contact hour reporting period is that one of the results is that there's a short period of about 6 weeks where hours are essentially being counted twice. So the hours between March 14th to April 30th, we already counted those in the aid calculation for fiscal year 2020, or we already used those hours in your consortia's total that calculated your aid for this current year. And now hours from that period will essentially count again a second time for fiscal year 2021. We're hopeful that for most of you, that's actually good news because it's better. You had more hours in that time period in 2019 than you did in 2020. However, we recognize that, or we have heard in at least one case of a consortium that did experience a significant decrease in hours due to a service disruption at a site in that March to April 2019 time period. And it does seem unfair to sort of penalize a consortium for that twice, 2 years in a row. So we've been able to work out a workaround for that consortium, and we want to make sure that all others know that if you are in that situation, please contact us, and we will figure out how to appropriately address that issue. So I'm going to pause here for just a second. Astrid, are there questions in the chat that we need to talk through?
Let's see, we have one question about the DL hours. If the number of DL hours is less than 3 hours for the month per student, is it necessary to separate what is prior to March 13th?
I suppose it's a bit of, yeah, I see Linda responded and said maybe not. Yeah, I mean, it seems that's a pretty small amount. I guess then my follow-up question would be how many students are we talking about? Because if that's 100 students, then yes, I'm assuming it's probably not 100 students. Use your best judgment. I guess you'll probably want to think about, are those 3 hours recorded on March 1st or March 30th, which, then you'll know whether or not they will be counted in the calculation at all. But I guess I would say best practice, try to make your data as clean as you can, but we can all agree 3 hours is not going to make or break anything.
Great. Thanks, Jody. I think that's it for now.
Okay. Great. So now I'm going to hand it over to Brad to talk about Table 7.
Thanks, Jody. Well, Table 7 is the same as it's been for the last couple of years now. So you can see that this is the table that we ask for your staffing information. We do want to get your administrator, counselors, and paraprofessionals. We do want that data listed by noting the positions, basically what was budgeted for the year at any one given time, how many positions did you have in each of those categories, but in part-time, full-time, or unpaid volunteers. And remember that teachers are a different situation. The feds want us to report those as the actual total number of teachers that worked in the program or in that consortium throughout the entire year. So if you had one teacher that started the year and then they left and you hired a new teacher, even though that is one position, technically that counts as 2 teachers. So you want to make sure you're doing an actual people count instead of at one point in time budgetary count. And And then also note with teachers, they want you to break down experience and teacher certifications. This is all the same as before. So let's go to the next slide. So if you're entering all of your SID staff details in, or all of your staff details in SID, the great news is running this report is going to be super easy. And also note that starting July 1, all ABE programs are required to input all of their staff and volunteers into SID. So in future years, if you're not already doing this, you will be able to run this report directly from SID. I also wanted to just caution you and let you know that Table 7 is not tied to your funding, and it is required primarily for our federal reporting. So we want you to get it accurate, but we don't want you to stress out about this table. And I think that's pretty much everything that we would want to that we have to say about Table 7, especially since there's nothing new about this table at this point in time. I see that Kirsten had a question about Table 7 will follow the regular timeline. Correct. Yep, Table 7 goes from July to June, and we know we're asking for this table for you to submit it June 1st, and that the full year isn't done yet, but we ask for you to estimate to the best of your ability at that point. So yes, Table 7 goes from July to June. Esther, are there any other questions about Table 7?
No, that was the only one.
Sounds good. Well, let's talk about Table 13. Table 13 is asking for you to share the information about your funding, the funding that your consortium received, and who got that federal and state funding. I will say, as someone that dove into these tables quite a bit last year, that I would say at least a quarter, if more than a quarter of the consortia that submitted these tables had some errors in these tables. So I really encourage you to get these tables correct, because when they're incorrect, I have to go through each and every consortium's table and start readjusting numbers or diving into it. And last year, that took several hours in order to kind of correct all of the Table 13 errors. So please take the time to make sure you're doing this right. And we're providing a little additional guidance this year on how to fill this out. So let's go to the next slide and talk about that. So we want you to make sure that the totals at the bottom for state and federal funding, those totals must match what was awarded to your consortium in the award letter. And so the federal total, make sure that that includes not just the federal ABE aid, but the tech aid, transitions aid, and low incidence disability aid if that applies to your consortium. You may need to estimate slightly, because we do know that while this report goes through the consortium or through the fiscal year, July to June, and we're asking for this before the end of June, you may have to do some estimating because of that, but that is okay. Estimate to the best of your ability, but make sure those amounts match the award letter. And we also want to make sure that the total number of providers that you're listing throughout Table 13 match the total number of providers that you're listing on Table B. So let's go talk through maybe two examples about this. So here's an example from one program or from one consortium. You can see this is their award letter. They had $177,000 in state ABE aid. And you can see that their consortium had more than $9,000 in federal aid when you totaled in not only the federal ABE aid entitlement, but also the technology aid. So let's go to Table 13. So here, this consortium did it perfectly. Those numbers match in the consortium totals at the bottom. It was also fairly easy because this consortium, all of their funding went to local education agencies or school districts. So they were able to just put that they had 3 different providers within their consortium, but all their federal money went to the school districts, and all the state money went to those school districts. So that was pretty straightforward. Let's talk about another example here. So here's an example where we have a consortium that has about $7.5 million in state ABE aid, and they have about nearly $750,000 in federal aid when you total up all 4 components that consortium was receiving. So when we look at Table 13 and what that should look like, you'll see here that it was actually split between some school districts and some community-based organizations. But overall, it looks great because when you look at the consortium totals at the bottom, the federal ABE aid matches what was in the award letter, and the state ABE aid matches what was in the award letter. So that is excellent that those consortium totals match your award letter. I think that's pretty much everything about Table 13. Any questions from our chat? Any questions you have about Table 13? Again, one thing I would really caution you to do is look carefully at Table 13, look at those totals, and look at the total number of providers to make sure that those numbers add up.
Brad, I'm not seeing any questions about this table.
Excellent. That sounds good. Well, let's move on to the next one. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Jody.
Great. Thanks, Brad. So the last table in the application is Table B. Table B is where you are going to list your providers, sites, and other members of your consortium. I do want to let you know that we have changed Table B somewhat from last year. We're trying, I think this is the third year we have required this table, and for the last couple of years we've tweaked a little. We want to make it as straightforward as possible for you to fill out, but we also want to make sure that we're getting solid data from it that works for what we need that for. So in terms of Table B, first you want to think about your ABE sites, and just a note about that, Table B says June 1st of 2020, but at this point, there's a great deal of uncertainty, I think, about which of our physical sites will actually be hosting physical programming on June 1st. So let's just shift our thinking, think back before COVID-19 and use March 1st instead. So please include on here all of your sites that were operational as of March 1st. Then I also want to remind you about how we are using the term provider. So a provider is any entity within a consortium that uses ABE funding to provide ABE instruction, or in other words, to pay one or more ABE instructors. So in all cases, the fiscal agent or the grantee is an ABE provider. In some cases, that entity is the only ABE provider in the consortium, but in some other cases, there are additional ABE providers within the consortium. So the fiscal agent actually passes on some of the ABE funding to other entities, school districts, or CBOs are the most common. And then any of those entities or all of those entities that receive that funding to pay their own instructors are ABE providers. So we want all of your providers listed on this table in the top section. A couple of notes about this. There is no longer a column for grantee or subrecipient. We are kind of moving away from that language, and we're trying to more consistently use the language provider instead with the definition that I've just been telling you. So we're no longer asking you to identify grantee or subrecipients. We're just asking you to list all entities that are providers in the first section of Table B. And then all other consortium members that are not providers should be listed in the second section. A couple other notes. When you are listing the programming site, please think of the name of the building as people in your community refer to it. So maybe it's a high school building, maybe it's a community center, maybe it's the M-State campus, maybe it's the Career Force Center, whatever the name of that building is, as folks in the community refer to it, please use that. Please use complete address the way you would put it into Google Maps or MapQuest if you were going to drive there. And the format that we want is address, comma, city, comma, MN, and then the 5-digit zip code. And the reason that we want that is because we map these sites. We create a map that shows where ABE sites are across the state. And new this year, we have added a final column to indicate if a site is non-public. And what we mean by non-public is that it only serves individuals who are already associated with the programming at that site. The most obvious example is a correctional facility that's not open to the general public, obviously. Another example might be an employer where you offer a class, but it's only for employees who are employed there. So I want to show you a correct example of Table B, and I'll just recognize that I started with Detroit Lakes Table B from last year as a starting point, but this isn't exhaustive. It's just an example, and I wanted it to fit on one page. So for Detroit Lakes, there is only one provider, but number of programming sites, and a couple of those sites are marked as non-public because one is a jail and one is a treatment center. In addition, in the second section, there is a list of member districts that are members of the consortium, but that do not receive ABE funding to provide ABE services. So those districts are listed there. Here's another correct example. For this one, I started with the Table B from last year from Southeast Minnesota, Owatonna. Again, it's not complete. I just pulled part of it to use as an example. So this example has 3 providers, so 3 school districts that are providers. The first 2 each have 1 site. The third has 2 different sites. And then in the second section, there are some additional school district members that are members of the consortium, but not providers. So those are a couple of good examples of Table B. I have a couple of incorrect examples just to illustrate common mistakes. These are not actual examples. I would not call anyone out like that. These are made up examples. So I invite you to take a second to think about what the mistake is on this Table B. Anybody's a super fast thinker and typer, you can type it in. So the mistake here is the programming sites just list the name of cities. Yep, Teresa got it, good job. And so we really want you to use the building names here for programming site. Here is another example of a common mistake that we saw last year. Actually, this example has 2 mistakes. Give you a second to see if you can find either. Yes, thank you, Linda. This is, oops, sorry, wrong way. This is the first mistake, is that there is not a complete address. So please don't just give us the name of a city, or please don't give us a PO box, because we cannot map that. Great, and Julie got the other one. If you are serving a non-public site, please be sure to mark it as non-public, such as a jail. Excellent. So final note about Table 13 and Table B. As Brad mentioned, when you are filling out Table 13, you should list the number of providers. So in this example, this Table 13 has lists 3 providers. Then on your Table B, in the top section where you are listing providers, there should be 3 entities listed there. So please make sure before submitting your application that the number of providers on Table 13 matches the number of providers on Table B. All right, I'm going to pause here for a second. Are there any other questions about the annual application, about the tables?
So Jody, we did have one question that Brad answered in the chat, but just to make sure that everybody saw this. and that it gets on the recording, a question about whether to enter other ABE consortia that have received regional transitions funding from their fiscal agent on table 13. And Brad chatted in that, no, you should not include those other ABE consortia in your table 13.
Yes, correct. Yeah, good question.
No other questions so far.
Okay. So if you have any other questions, go ahead and chat those in. I will also just note that there are some brief videos on the application and each of these tables. So if you have some questions as you're filling them out, you can consider that a resource. Those are available on our mnabe.org page at the section that has state ABE presentations.
Jody, we do have another question. If we have a space in a human services building with other career force partners, do we list that building name?
Yes, I believe so, Teresa. I think I assume what's happening is that your ABE program runs some ABE programming in that human services building. So yes, if that's the case, then yes, list that building name. Great. Yeah, thank you, Karen. I do hope that those videos can be a quick reference. If you just have a quick question, I can't remember, but I don't think any of them are much longer than 5 minutes or so. So do consider those a quick reference as you're filling out tables and the application. All right. Great. I'm going to keep going. We just have one more section, some more information, and mainly reminders to pass on to you at this point. Mostly because at this point of the year, we want you to be thinking of the end of the fiscal year and what that means for your ABE funding. So first of all, just to orient us to what we're talking about. So this annual ABE application that we are talking about today is for state ABE funding, which is Finance Code 322, and federal ABE funding, which is Finance Code 438. And if you're like, what do those codes mean? Those codes are from UFARS. And if you're like, what does UFARS mean? UFARS is the accounting system that school districts in Minnesota have to use to track and report their spending. So if you work at a school district, your business office folks are very accustomed to using UFARS. We do recognize some of our ABE providers are not school districts, and we know for you sometimes these UFARS codes get tricky, but we'll try to support as much as we can. But just so you know that this is what we are talking about are these accounting codes. So a couple of just general reminders about your state and federal ABE funding. First of all, ABE funding can only be used for ABE services for eligible adults. It can't be used for K-12, and it can't be used for general community ed services. So this money is dedicated to the folks in our communities who need adult education services and are eligible for those services. Also, ABE funds technically are reimbursement for the cost of operating an ABE program. And because of this, the funds cannot be used to build up a fund balance. So we just want you to know that in case that comes up in your district with district leadership or in the business office. ABE funds are different than some other streams of educational funding. And in the past, quite a while in the past now, it was possible to build up or add to a fund balance with ABE funds, but that is no longer true. So ABE funds need to be spent to reimburse expenses or costs of operating ABE programming. Couple other reminders, there are caps on how much of ABE funding can be spent on admin. There's 5% cap on state funding, 5% cap on federal funding. And just a note that that cap is for the entire award amount, which is the funding for the entire consortium, not a separate cap for each provider. So as you are, or an accountant is coding the admin expenses, the correct code to use is object code 110. Again, I'm talking about UFARS codes. So you can use that. That's appropriately used, 110, for the salary of an administrator who doesn't directly oversee ABE. So probably any of you who are hearing my voice, you are directly overseeing ABE programming, and your salary should not be coded to 110. If you are an ABE manager, your salary should be 120. So this 5% cap doesn't include the salary for the ABE manager, who many of you are. It includes salary, that cap applies to salary of the person who oversees you in most cases. All right, a couple of things to keep in mind as we approach the fiscal year end. First of all, when we think about federal funding, remember your federal funds need to be used up by June 30th. And there is a deadline for drawing those funds in SERVs, and that's October 1st. So remember, this is reimbursement. You need to incur those expenses by June 30th, but you can draw from SERVs to reimburse for those expenses through October 1st. After that, there will be a lock put on, and you will no longer be able to draw down those funds. So some districts leave all those federal funds in SERVs till the very end. We recommend at this point of year for you to be talking to your business office about that, so that it doesn't fall off the radar and nobody makes those draws in time. Quick question for you. What happens at the end of the fiscal year if there are federal ABE funds that are not spent? So if you got an award for federal ABE funds, if your consortium was awarded $50,000 and you've only drawn down $45,000 and you don't draw down anymore, or you don't spend anymore and draw down to reimburse it, what happens? Nadine, you are close, but what you are suggesting about spending in the fifth quarter does not apply to federal funds. That applies to state funds. So in terms of federal funds, yes, Margot is closer. They are sent back, you lose it. Any unspent federal funds roll back into the total statewide pot of funding for the following fiscal year. So if you do not spend your federal ABE funds, those funds are lost to your consortium, but they do go back to our system and we distribute them out to everybody else the following year. So in terms of federal funding, okay, oh, yep, sorry. Nope, sorry. In terms of state funding, I confused myself where I was on my slide for a second. State funding is a little bit different. As we approach the end of the fiscal year, Nadine, this is what you were thinking about. Up to 20% of state funds can be spent between July 1st and September 30th of the following fiscal year. We sometimes call that quarter 5. So that means you have an award of state ABE funding for this fiscal year that ends June 30th, but if you are not able to spend up all of that funding by June 30th, you can also spend it in July, August, or September of this year. And note, and yes, Nadine also pointed this out, when you do this, it is important that these funds are course coded directly using UFARS codes. And the course code for this year So the course code that will be used this year, if any of your current funds are spent between July 1st and September 30th, is 010. And just a note about carryover codes for those of you who are interested in this sort of thing. The carryover code for this current fiscal year 20, is 010. And then with next year, it starts over again. So for fiscal year 21, it's 001, etc. All right, so a quick quiz question for you about state funding. What happens if you don't spend up all your state funds by the end of the year or in quarter 5? What if you leave some of those funds unspent? What happens to those funds? I will give you just 1 second and I'll tell you the answer. This is different than federal funds. So they scrolled that quick. I think some of you might have got this. Any unspent state funds are returned to the state general fund. In other words, those funds are lost to you as an ABE grantee or consortium and to our entire system. So if you do not spend that state funding, it's gone. And Todd notes, in theory, you contribute to reducing the forecast $2.4 billion deficit, but not much, Todd, I would say. Great, so the takeaway from this is a few questions for you to check with your accountant, check with your business office at this point in the year. First question to ask is, are we on track with our budget? Second question to ask is, how much state and federal funds do we have remaining at this point? Then to think about, how can we be sure to spend all of our federal funds by June 30th? And if we have any state funds remaining on June 30th, to keep in mind, we have an additional quarter to use them, so how can we use those funds up? And I think I skipped over this on an earlier slide, but please be thinking about, I think it's possible this year, because there may have been events or a special class or something this spring that you budgeted for but were not able to do because of COVID-19, you might be in this situation where there is some amount of funding that didn't get used for what it was originally budgeted for. So please be thinking about a one-time expense to spend up those funds. And I think, as there's some conversation in the chat, a technology purchase would be a great idea. Another thing you could consider is a subscription to a distance learning platform online. We know some of those are free, but some of them have a cost. Another thing you could consider is a special curriculum development project where you could pay an instructor some additional time, perhaps to develop an online course. So yes, please be thinking about how to spend up all of your funding. Please spend up all of your federal funding by June 30th, and keep in mind that you have an extra quarter to spend up to 20% of your state funds. So here's just a little bit more information of what to think about or what to do if you want more information about grants or finances. Astrid, are there any questions in the chat that we should go through?
No, I think you addressed them, and just a reminder that Tom chatted out for people to remember is that anyone who's currently using Burlington English who wants to continue to use that will need to buy their own seats as of July 1st, because we are ending the state-supported licenses for that platform.
Yes, good point. Thank you, Tom. All right, then the last thing we have are some resources and reminders about PD. Astrid, I'll let you decide how quickly you want to go through these.
Yeah, let's go pretty quickly. We have just a few minutes left, but we did want to make sure that these things are on your radar as we've all been quickly adapting to the many changes. Our ABE support network providers have been hard at work, moving quickly and diligently and really effectively to meet the needs of everyone in the staff. So I just want to put out a huge thank you to everyone that's been working to provide just-in-time professional development to support the field. So a couple of resources, a lot of these are reminders that we shared on our webinar last Thursday, but just a reminder to everyone that we do have a relatively new Schoology group focused as a place to share resources around COVID-19 and distance education. So make sure that you and your staff are members of that group and checking it regularly, sharing your questions there. Jody, let's go to the next slide. Also, just a reminder that Atlas and the other support network staff have been hosting a series of informal ABE teacher virtual coffee breaks that have been just excellent. Lots of interaction and sharing, wonderful ideas and resources being shared. If you've missed any of those, the really detailed notes have been archived in the COVID-19 Schoology group in the resources section. And we do have a handful left scheduled in the month of May. You can register for those on the Atlas calendar. If you go to the next slide, we also have a variety of upcoming webinars happening in May. One happening tomorrow focused on synchronous teaching, maximizing instructional time online, a MobiMax webinar in the afternoon tomorrow, and then a number of others looking forward throughout the month of May. So all of that information is on the Atlas calendar. You can get registered there. And if you miss any of these webinars, you can always go to our very own Minnesota ABE PD YouTube channel to view the archives. So that's something to bookmark. This Friday, we'll be having our first CCRS Instructional Leadership Summit. Registration ends today, so if you have not yet registered and you are someone who's an instructional leader in your program around supporting others with the standards, this is going to be an excellent day. I'm really excited about this. We'll be meeting from 9 till about 1:30 with a series of breakout sessions. Go to the next slide. If you haven't heard yet, Summer Institute is moving online. We'll be meeting virtually August 19th and 20th, and the call for proposals deadline has been extended to the end of this month, May 31st. So you can head over to the Literacy Action Network website to submit your proposal. And then just a reminder about some of the excellent distance learning resources that are out there. The first link is to an archive of an event that happened just this past Friday and Monday, hosted by our K-12 colleagues, technology specialists. You can view an archive of that event. Our distance learning team maintains an excellent resource, Minnesota ABE distance learning website. And then nationally, you can turn to the Ed Tech Center distance learning website, as well as weekly webinars on distance education strategies. Go to the next slide. And then finally, just a reminder to stay connected. This is a really important time to be reading your newsletter that comes in every Tuesday to hear about things that are getting scheduled every day and stay up to date with those. And then some really excellent articles highlighting the amazing work that's happening in programs around the state. And I do see in the chat, Leave asking about changes to state-supported distance learning. We are still in the process of making some decisions about that, and we'll be sharing that information with the field as we have it. And then finally, just want to make sure that everybody is aware of the PELSB COVID-19 updates and FAQs on their website. We know that some things are currently in flux. I just had some communication today with PELSB, and they encouraged us to watch for more information in the next week or two and check back on that FAQ. There are some decisions being made about potentially extending the deadline for licenses that are up for renewal in 2020. State legislators are working on that currently. And then I know we've had some questions about those local relicensure committees that may be backlogged because they're not meeting. And so PELSB expects some additional guidance around that issue as well. So stay tuned on those topics.
All right, thank you for those updates and reminders, Astrid. And we are at the end of our scheduled time, so thank you so much to all of you for joining us. We'll stay on the line a little while longer if anybody else has any additional questions that they'd like to ask. But otherwise, thanks again, and we'll see you on another webinar soon.